We are really fortunate. We all talk about the history of Las Vegas and the things that are pertinent to this club as an educational organization. And we've had a lot of wonderful speakers over the years. And now we have another one because we have someone who's intimately involved in the making of the history of Las Vegas. Bill Ragsdale worked for Slim Ewing, and if you were at Ralph and Charles' presentation yesterday, you noticed that a ton of the chips from the Caribbean were all the Ewing mold, and I kept thinking to myself, this is wonderful. What a great lead-in to Bill the next morning. I didn't know that Bill was in the room, so I stood up and said, okay, before everybody leaves, I want you to know this is really great because tomorrow morning, Bill Ragsdale, who worked for Slim Ewing, is here to talk about the Ewing mold. And Bill was in the back of the room. It's a good thing I didn't say, like, Bill's here tomorrow morning and don't show up. So, it was really good. Bill is going to have a PowerPoint presentation, as you can obviously see, and for the first time in a while now, we actually have someone who, when I said, Bill, Claude's not here to help me with the computer, and I don't know how to make the computer match up with the thing, Bill looked at me and said, don't worry about it. It's all covered. I plugged the thing in, and boom, there it was. Bill's going to come up. He's going to talk to you guys. We know we have a time limit to a certain extent, but Bill is going to kind of run the show, and I'd like you to welcome Bill Ragsdale.
Very good. Can you hear me all right in the back of the room? Works fine. Facilities here at the Riviera are great, I'll tell you. Let's see, just by way of introduction, Bill Ragsdale. I started, I graduated from the University of California, Berkeley, electrical engineering, worked at the Lawrence Livermore Lab for about 6 years, worked for 2 small independent companies, and then started my own company and ran it for 25 years and retired 10 years ago. As I get started, I would like to introduce 2 celebrities here today. The first is Al McGibbon. Al, would you just stand up quickly and say hi to Al? I worked with Al 25, 30, almost 40 years ago at Lawrence Livermore Lab and at the Nevada test site. And up in the front here is Ken Williams. Stand up to Ken. You'll see Ken later on in the dealer room. Ken is Slim's nephew, and he currently lives in Slim Ewing's home, and he has a large amount of memorabilia from Slim and from those days. Slim built a complex in the neighborhood there by joining his house together with another one and buying a house next door and putting a big shop. So in his retirement years, he had a little small facility right around in the neighborhood. And Ken is now living there. So on to the presentation. Okay, first we get to meet John Alvin Slim Ewing. While I think of it right now, there was only one person in the world that ever called, there were only 2 people in the world that ever called him John. One was O.W. Bill Glenn, who worked at the shop part-time. He was about 80 or 85 years old, and he always called him John. He was always John to O.W. Bill Glenn. Bill Glenn has the distinction of having worked for Charlie Fay in about 1915. Charlie Fay invented the slot machine. He invented the 3-reel, hidden reel slot machine, and Bill Glenn worked for him. The only other people that would call Slim Ewing John was the IRS. When they would come in the door, they would ask for John Ewing because the only time his name appeared is John would be on a tax return. Slim Ewing was born in 1904 in Ashland, Kentucky, and we'll very briefly cover his life, and then in a moment we'll expand on this. He died 11 years ago here in Las Vegas. He was married twice, and he had 1 daughter, Jean, twin granddaughters, and then numerous grandchildren. I tried to find the name of his first wife, and I had never heard him utter the word, and Bertie, his wife, said it once that I can remember, and I never noted what it was. And I even asked nephew Ken what the first wife's name was, and he'd never heard it or didn't remember it either. So that is a little blank spot in Slim's life. Anyway, we were quite close. He sort of turned into my godfather. He came to my wedding in 1971 when I got married, and I attended his funeral and was a pallbearer at Bertie's funeral 4 years later. Find the right button to push. There we go. This is Slim's wife, Bertie Ewing. They met and were married in Bakersfield, California, and were married from about 1948 or 7 or 8 until he passed away in 1997. The photo on the right was taken on a tour bus, I think somewhere in the Virgin Islands. I traveled with them extensively, both on business and socially. So here's a little timeline on Slim Ewing's life. As I said, he was born in Ashland, Kentucky. He was orphaned at the age of 15. They had a flu epidemic, and both of his parents died simultaneously. His father died on Christmas Day when he was 15 years old. He had a difficult childhood. He had 2 sisters and a brother. Ruth, Eleanor were the sisters, and Harry was his brother. He was never particularly close to them. His father worked at the local high school and died on Christmas Day, and the family word is that as a result, Slim never was particularly fond of Christmas. It really wasn't a major event to him, and it possibly was the fact his father was associated with the high school that he dropped out of school at the age of 15, never completed high school. He got to about the sophomore year of high school and left. He worked as an automotive mechanic for a couple of years in the Ashland area, and the next I know was he turned up in Salt Lake City as an airplane pilot. He worked as the pilot for the sheriff in Salt Lake City. It turns out he was run out of town at knife point by an irate husband who came and chased him down at the airport and accused him of having relations with his wife. Slim hopped on his motorcycle, took off for Los Angeles, and that was the last he ever saw of Salt Lake City. In the Los Angeles area, he hit town in the late 20s, worked as a locksmith primarily, and did a little bit of stunt work in the movies, rode motorcycles with a fellow named Vic Shorb, and used to tell the story how they would ride down Wilshire Boulevard on their motorcycles shooting jackrabbits with their pistols. And that shows you how undeveloped the area was at that time. Slim then began to do work up and down the San Joaquin Valley. He had a funny hat, baseball cap with a little brass plate on the front that said locksmith. And he would go from town to the lock shops up and down San Joaquin Valley and say to them, introduce himself and say, I'm Slim Ewing, I could do any lock work that you choose not to do. The locksmiths would sometimes get a little haughty about it and say, well, what do you mean that I choose not to do, like I can do the work? And Slim would say, well, let's make it a little clearer. And then he would look over his glasses, like Ken knows he used to look over the glasses, and he'd say, well, let's put it this way. He says, I can come by and do any work that you don't know how to do. He specialized in the hard stuff, and he developed a method for opening in the floor safes, which were very popular at that time, particularly in service stations. And so he could open and make a key to an in-the-floor safe without any drilling. So, and because of their popularity, he was known for and was called up and down the San Joaquin Valley. He settled in Bakersfield in the late 30s and was married, and that's where he had his daughter Jean. He transitioned from locksmith to slot operator. So in those days, he ran a pinball route and a slot route of cash pay slot machines. And that time in California, they had cash pay slot machines were legal. Through the war years, his marriage declined, and he made a deal with his wife that said, at my age and with one child and married, he said, I have a draft deferment. So if we stay married through the war, then we can divorce and you can have everything and I will just leave and check out. And so that was the deal. End of the war, they were divorced, and that was the end of the marriage, and things went their separate way after that. I understand that also Slim had further resentment because his wife turns out married his brother, and that seemed to fuel some of the little family separations. So shortly after World War II, he married Bertie, and the next turning point in the life of his career was about 1950. He was sitting in the Golden Nugget Casino playing 10-cent 21. In those days, women couldn't deal on the Strip, but they could deal downtown. And so he was downtown checking out the female dealers at the Golden Nugget, was talking to a pit boss. And the pit boss, somehow they got in the conversation because Slim was also an operator. Oh, I have to back the story up very slightly. In 1949, California had a state referendum to legalize slot machines in California. At the end of the war, for whatever reasons, the political climate changed, and there had been no enabling legislation on slot machines. So the gambling operators were going to try to get it written into the Constitution. Slim was the treasurer, state treasurer of that association, and helped manage the 1949 referendum to legalize slot machines. Las Vegas was just coming on stream very strongly, and of course the racetrack operators and a lot of the churches were all against it, and so the referendum failed. At that time, Slim was looking for some opportunity that involved gambling that would be out of state, and Las Vegas was natural. So about 1950, he was playing 21 at the Nugget, found out that they had a real fraud problem in handling money. Under the tables, they just would have a little wooden box with a cabinet lock on it, at which the bills were passed. Slot through the table, push the bills down in. A security guard would carry the box back to the casino, but it was common practice for the security guards to take a pocket comb out, rake it through that slot and pull out a bill on the way back to the cage. And so you might get a dollar bill, you might get 100, big payday $100 bill in 1950. Also, you could go down to Von Tobel's hardware store and you could buy duplicate keys because those boxes were made in the carpenter shop. They would buy the locks at Von Tobel's hardware store, and they were all keyed alike. It was a Cat 11 key, and you could go down and buy another one. So a lot of the guards had their own key to the money box. So Slim went back to Bakersfield, invented the drop box. We'll see a little more about that later on. And so from the mid-1950s on, he formed Ewing Manufacturing, and it turned into a full-line manufacturer. Anything in wood and plastic having to do with casinos, he would manufacture, and then he was an agent for a full line of equipment. He continued through the 50s, 60s, and 70s as a gambling operator. We'll talk about that in a moment. So a little personal background. In about 1928, when he was in Los Angeles, he was 6'4", weighed 150 pounds, and therefore he was slim. However, later in life, he probably weighed about 240 or so, and he was no longer slim, but the name stuck. And you see information there on the whole summary. The comment on the stunt work with Vic Shorb. Vic later on became a slot operator, a partner of Slim in the slot operation at Bakersfield, moved to Las Vegas also, and had an independent route of slot machines here in Las Vegas. So how did I meet Slim Ewing? How did we link up? Well, in the 1940s, another locksmith that was in the Bakersfield area was named P.S. Bible, Philip Sheridan Bible. He retired to Morro Bay, California, and when I went away to college and came back my first summer out of college, freshman summer, I went to work for P.S. Bible. So for 2 summers, we worked as tinker locksmiths, traveling in a Gillig Brothers retrofitted Gillig Brothers Muni bus that had bunks and stoves in it. So we toured into the unincorporated areas around California doing lock work, where there was first there was no business licenses and there was no established locksmith, and we could go in and on a route basis we would just travel the countryside. The second summer, Bible said to me, he said, "Bill, I want you to meet the best locksmith in the world." He said, "We're going to Las Vegas." So we drove over to Las Vegas, spent 3 days. Slim and P.S. Bible sat in the front of the office drinking coffee and reminiscing and telling stories about the old days. And whenever the telephone would ring, then I would take the lock calls around Las Vegas. So I just got to know, doing a little 3 days worth of locksmithing around Vegas. The next summer, I called up Slim and said, "Could I come to work for you?" And he said, "Sure." So for the next 2 summers, I worked for him in Las Vegas. About half time it was locksmithing work, and about half the time it was in the factory, punching sheet metal, bending sheet metal, drilling plastic, making things. Through the 60s, then, I went to work for the Lawrence Livermore Lab, but during my vacation and time off, Slim would holler and say, "Okay, I'm going down to the Caribbean for 2 or 3 weeks, come on along with me." So I would go along and carry suitcases and speak a little Spanish and buy plane tickets and be a gopher, and we would travel through the Caribbean. And let's see, I made a quick list of the places that we visited. We went to Aruba, we opened up the Aruba Sheraton. Slim provided all the casino equipment at the Aruba Sheraton. I'll talk about that a little bit more in a minute. In Curacao, Mexico, Ecuador, Colombia, Panama, the Virgin Islands, Puerto Rico, and of course the ever popular, dear to our heart, Portland, Maine. Here's a little picture of, just to prove we were there, of Slim in Quito, Ecuador. The slide on the upper right was in a gift store buying carvings. Slim was quite a collector and would always come back with a big suitcase stuffed with carvings, antiques, ponchos. And the lower slide on the right, we're out in front of the hotel in Quito with the poncho dealers doing shopping. And a little memorabilia here. The top right picture is Slim at my shop. I had a manufacturing company in Hayward, California. And this incarnation of it, we did industrial packaging. I would mention also that the name of the company was Dorado Packaging. Well, it's named after the Dorado Beach in Puerto Rico. When my partner and I started the company, we made a list of about 100 names for the company, and we started crossing off the names we didn't want. And the last name left on the list was Dorado. So it became Dorado Packaging, because I was just fond of that area in Puerto Rico, having been there with Slim on our way to the Conquistador. My next company was Dorado Systems, which did electronics manufacturing, and my current company is a publishing company, and it's called Dorado IDS Corporation. So I've only had 3 companies, and they've all been at Dorado. The photo on the lower right is taken at our wedding, because when we honeymooned, we left with Slim and Bertie. So my bride on the extreme left there, Ann, with the brilliant red hair, then Slim, myself, and then Slim's wife Bertie as we're getting in the car to leave on the honeymoon. So we drove to LA, put them on an airplane back to Las Vegas, and then we took off for Martinique, Puerto Rico, and New Orleans, where we honeymooned. I think we had about a 4-week honeymoon through the Caribbean, and I basically wanted to take Ann back and show her all the places that I'd been with Slim. So we'll do a quick review of Slim's gambling operations. As I said before, he was a slot operator during World War II. He always had the theory that he was performing a public service, and it was at the behest of the U.S. government to allow gambling in California. Because in the Bakersfield area, it was a very heavy oil production, and because of the need for the war effort to keep oil production working, he felt it was government policy to keep the oil field workers as broke as possible. And the gambling slot machines helped that, because that way, if they were broke enough, they would continue to work in the oil fields. If they made too much money, they'd leave and go somewhere else. So he actually resented it quite a bit when they were talking about outlawing gambling, because he felt he was doing the civic benefit. And as I said before, he was the state treasurer of the Association to Continue Gambling. In about 1950, he was a partner in the Wagon Wheel Motel and Casino in Jackson Hole, Wyoming, with Al and Helen Remington, who were dear friends for years. Slim and Al flew airplanes in those days, and so the part of their fun was flying around the country in their airplanes, and then in the summer season, they operated the Wagon Wheel. And they were lifelong friends after that. In about 52, he invented the drop box. In around the 1955 time period, he was an investor in the Carver House. Remember, in those days, Las Vegas had some pretty strong color bars, and African Americans were not allowed in the casinos on the Strip or downtown. So they had the Moulin Rouge on Bonanza, I think it was on Bonanza, and they had the Carver House over on the west side. And so there was a black man who ran the Carver House, and Slim financed him. It ran for a few years, but was not particularly successful and faded away. Through the mid-50s into the 70s, Slim was the operator at the Greyhound Bus Depot. And here in Las Vegas was right at number 1 Fremont Street, where the Plaza Hotel, is the Plaza still there? Anyway, wherever the plaza was, that was the Greyhound Bus Depot. He was a slot operator there, and also in Reno, and he also was a slot operator at McCarran Airport. And in his back shop, he had coin wrapping equipment, and Bertie, they would go out and collect the coins, pay them for cash, bring them back, wrap them, take the wrapped coins back to the location. And Slim just always liked to have a cash business. It was just no receipts, cash business. It was just very, very comforting to have. in the mid-'70s, he had a partner, John Donahue, in Tegucigalpa, Honduras, in a casino there. Unfortunately, a lot of the Caribbean casinos would suffer from either greed or the excessive consumption of alcohol, and management would fail. And John Donahue suffered from both points. And so after 3 or 4 years, that partnership, the casino faded away and failed. And finally, in the 80s, Slim owned a pawn shop that was just off of Fremont Boulevard downtown. Al's Loans, or Al's Buy and Sell. It was a nice thing because he had the first choice of diamond rings when anything would come in. Pistols and diamond rings. He'd bring them home, and Bertie always had a new diamond ring about every 5 or 6 weeks, and another impressive stone. So we'll talk about inventions. In the 30s, Slim developed this decoder that would analyze, without taking it apart externally, it would analyze the in-floor safe and allow him to make keys. That was his first little claim to fame. In the 40s, he developed anti-cheat mechanisms for his slot machines, because his route would be typically in bars. In those days, they were what they call cowboys or crossroaders that would go out and cheat slot machines, typically by drilling. If you just take a little hand drill, a little hand squeeze drill, and come up on the side of a certain slot machine, drill a little hole in the side, you could just reach in, and slot machines have 5 clicks. Well, the 4th click, the first 3 clicks are the reel stopping, the 4th click are the pay fingers, and the 5th click is the pay slide. So when the 4th click occurs, some levers press forward against discs, sensing the combination of characters to pay. Well, if you release that prematurely, they force a pay. So you just drill a little hole in the side of the slot machine, stick a bent wire in, put a coin in, pull the handle, pull the wire, which is, of course, inside the slot machine on this 4th click lever, you get a guaranteed pay. Now, you may get a couple of cherries, you may get a jackpot. They would just drill a little hole in, pull the thing, pay, pay, pay. Slim developed in particular one method, which was to put a little baffle in front of that area with a micro switch with a little concealed light back at the bar. And so when somebody drilled in and touched that little plate, it would flash a light for the bartender. And the bartender would know somebody was out there trying to steal from the machine. Of course, the plate blocked them from getting the wire to that little lever, and so the method didn't work. And then the bartender would begin to talk to the person and kind of hassle them a little bit, and the person knew they were being watched, and so they would continue to play the slot machine so as to not be suspicious. And so in reality, they forced the cheat to continue playing the slot machine while they were blocking him. Another thing they did was they would take pinball machines, and over the pay mechanism, they put a neon transformer, which is a 20,000 volt transformer. So they would stick the wire into the slot machine, hit the 20,000 volt thing, and jump and get fried. So these are the sort of things he did in the 40s. In 1945, or thereabouts, he and a man named Wilson developed a lockpick, which I'll show in the next slide. And in the 50s, as I said, he developed the drop box. In 55 onward, he developed a wide range of products. We see a big, long list of there, and we'll talk about a few of those in a moment. And in 1976, he did the improved drop box and patented it. These are photos of his Ace key machine. If you recognize it, the Ace key machine is the round keyhole lock that's used still very heavily in parking meters, in slot machines, coin-operated equipment. It was developed in the late 20s by the Shin family in Chicago and the company Chicago Lock. A man named Wilson, don't know his first name, but Wilson of Taft, California, developed, along with Slim, developed a key machine and a pick. In those days, the lock technology was patented, and you could only get the keys from the Chicago Lock, and they did not sell duplicating machines, so no locksmith could make the keys. Well, that's never going to stop Slim. So he and Wilson teamed up, and they developed this key machine. When I was working for him, there was an Army locker full of all of the leftover tooling from this. When this came out and they started to sell them, the Shin family contacted him, and either due to persuasion or legal threats, one way or the other, they decided not to sell the lockpick and the key machine. So they just made them for their own use, and they made a few for close friends. So in about 1962 or 3, I took out the remaining tooling they had and went back in the shop, and with Slim's blessing, finished up the last 2 or 3 of the key machines and the lock picks. And so those are for my own collection. They'd been in storage for the last 25 years, and I brought them out and polished them up to take the photo. The pick on the lower right has 7 pick fingers around in a circle. To use it, you just put it over the face of the lock, loosen those screws, and then push the little pins in and out, and you can feel, for each pin, you can feel the little shear line, tighten the little screw down, and it takes maybe 30 seconds, 45 seconds, and the pick becomes a replica of the key. You then can use that, and many of these requires multiple turns. You have to unscrew the lock. It may take 2 or 3 turns to undo a screw to open the door of a vending machine, and that pick does it because it becomes a replica of the key. You then use a guide and you measure the pin heights, and you can go cut a key by number, and the duplicating machine then cuts an exact duplicate to factory spec from that code. So we're going to talk about checks now. Now I will give a couple of little disclaimers. First is, in the casino business, they have reverse terms from what the public may be aware of. The people who are in a casino sitting on the chair in the front are not called gamblers, they're called players. And the people that own the casino or run the casino are called gamblers inside the business. Now, of course, we know the casino managers, gamblers, are not taking a gamble because the odds are on their side. But player, I guess, is a more respectful word for the public. Likewise, the public calls chips, chips, and the casino calls them checks. And so all in the trade, they're check trays, and they're, everything is check this and check that, because it's like a hat check. You go turn in your hat, you get a check for it, and then when you turn the check in, you get your hat back. And so I kind of bounce back and forth between the two terms. Well, and the other disclaimer is that most of the people in this room will probably know more about the internal mechanisms of the check business than I do, and some of these little fine points in history. So my apologies if I get something a little misstated. But as we know, the Portland Billiard Ball Company, formed in 1895, became the Burt Company, the 2 Burt brothers up in Portland, and they expanded in the 10s and 15s into checks, both the low-cost home poker style that's more of a styrene or acrylic, and then, of course, the non-duplicate, clay-filled checks that are used in casinos. It was amusing to Slim in those days, the misconceptions that would occur within the casino manager end of the business, because they thought that there were actually 4 or 5 manufacturers of checks, and that they were competitors and they were different. And they didn't realize that they all came from the Burt Company, and that it was your mold that gives you the distinctive pattern. And so Slim used to be amused when a casino manager would give him a little lecture about how a Jones check was better than a Paulson check, or how a T.R. King check was better than someone else, when in reality they're coming out of the same factory. And of course, in 1988, one of the Burt brothers died, and the remaining Burt brother sold to Chipco, which is now, I believe, is currently in Raymond, Maine. Is that where they are? Wherever. I believe these are the 5 major distributors then for the Burt Company. Paulson, which is by far and away the highest volume supplier, the top hat and cane mold. T.R. King. Mason, which I'm unfamiliar with, but my reference source said it had a hub mold. I'm not sure about that. Jones Brothers, and then of course the Ewing mold. I believe there were a couple of other companies who actually did mold checks likewise. I think Langworthy, who became Wyco, and they used a horsehead pattern. And then, of course, off to the side is Caro & Company in Europe, who supplied mostly the plaques that were used in European casinos. This is an exploded view of Slim's catalog. It was about 80-page catalog, and I just spread out some of the pages so you can see that he has, on the left-hand side, there's dealer shoes, there's trays, there are decals for slot machines, a big 6-wheel, and across into all the other supplies. Here are sales samples drawn not only from Ewing but from others, so you can see a little bit of the variety of the molds. There's one of Slim's sample checks is the red one that's on the left, second row down, second over. It says $1,000. These were his samples. He had them in a number of different colors, and I have 6 of them. My collection is very, very small. I have, a set of casino dice and 6 checks, and that's it. I used to take these checks and make earrings from them for girlfriends, but because of the weight, frankly, they were quite uncomfortable. So the date would usually wear them for about 10 or 15 minutes and say, "Can I take these off now?" "Okay, they're killing my ears." Which the weight is good in the casino business and bad if you're making earrings. These are some examples of his. The Embajador Casino, the $5 check on the top left, and then the Caribe Hilton on the lower right, or lower left. And then the front and back of his sample. If you notice, there's a flaw in the artwork, and I know you people just love these fine points. On his sample check, the last 2 digits of the post office box appear to have been altered in pen. They don't match the type of the other letters. And what I believe happened was either he changed his P.O. box after the artwork was made, or there was a typo on the artwork, and they caught it before they started to use the artwork. And so someone went in with pen and ink and just did a little retouch. But if you look at those last, I think it's a 08. Yeah, it's 1508, and the 08 don't match. They're a little tilted and a little blurry. The Ewing mold, as we know, has the 6 dice values, 1 through 6, and there's 18 patterns imprinted, and then the pip suit values of the cards fill in between the 6 dice for a total of 18 in a circle. The penetration is stronger in the Caribbean for the Ewing mold because Slim made sales calls down there. Most everyone else was mail order, but Slim was the one person who would travel face-to-face through the Caribbean, as I said, about every 18 months or so. And sometimes he was doing it just, socially and more for fun, and just to go down and say hi to all the old folks. And on the other hand, he would be tracking who's working where, keep his address book up to date. And I accompanied him on about 3 of those trips. Through a pure quirk of fate, I was present when he approved the mold at the Burt Company. There was no reason or plan, but it just happened to be. We were in New York City on our way to and from Puerto Rico, and the Burt Company said, "Okay, your mold is ready for approval." So we flew up to Portland, Maine, and spent a day touring and chatting and having lunch with the Burt brothers. And then we drove down to Leominster, New Hampshire, which is, I think it's about 50 or 60 miles south. Leominster was, in those days, very heavy in women's shoe heels and plastic molding. They had tool and die works down there to make the molds, and they did a big thing on plastic molding of heels for women's shoes. So if you ran a shoe company, you would go to some company in Leominster, and they would mold you the internal part of the shoe, which would then be covered with leather on the outside. So we went to one of the die shops that was making Slim's mold, and they had the mold they had proofed the checks with it, and so we saw the die, saw the mold and the checks, and made sure everything was satisfactory, and signed off and said, "Okay, it's acceptable." I took a picture at that time of it, and I couldn't locate my original picture. I might have given it to Slim, but this is a mold that is the same technology, just a little bit older and has been used. There's 4 die impressions. So the way they would work is on the non-duplicate checks, they have little colored inserts. So they would place the colored inserts into this mold, close the mold up. On the back side of that photograph, you can see those steel pins sticking up in the air. That's the upper half of the mold. So that gets flipped over, put into a hydraulic press. They load in the little inserts and the monogram in the center, close the mold up and heat it, and then inject plastic in the center, and then the plastic goes out on runners to those four cavities, filling the die and picking up the full image. The mold is heated with steam, and then they shoot cold water in to cool it. And it's a fairly slow process. It isn't that fast, because you've got to heat up that die to the melting point of plastic and then shoot in cold water to chill it down. On the right-hand side is the machine on which they make the mold. It's called EDM, electrode discharge machining. The mold themselves is made in tool steel, hardened steel, difficult to machine in fine detail. So the process works as they take a piece of graphite, carbon essentially, charcoal essentially, or diamond, depending on what form it is. Take a piece of graphite and they machine the reverse of the mold into the graphite. Okay? Then that is put into an EDM machine against the steel blank for the mold and surrounded by usually kerosene, and then a high-frequency electric arc is established between the two, and the electric arc etches away the steel, and they slowly push that piece of graphite into the steel block. And they aggressively flood and irrigate it with flowing kerosene, and that carries away the vaporized steel. So the graphite is not eroded. The graphite stays with the pattern, and the steel is eroded away. The kerosene turns dark from the steel that's carried away. And finally, you end up with a cavity that's an exact replica of that piece of graphite. And this is done 4 times. Well, it's actually done 8 times. It's done 4 times for the front of the check, and then 4 times for the reverse of the check. And that way, they only have to machine the graphite block once, and they get to use it 8 times to make all the molds. And if for high volume use, they were making more than 1 mold, they could use it a number of times. It's still in use today, a very popular technology. It's been expanded beyond that. So we'll talk about the drop box. The drop box was really the bread and butter of the Ewing company because it was an exclusive item and it was highly needed, very high demand, very high need. And since it had such high security implications, they had to trust the vendor of the drop box because the vendor knew the key combinations and could readily make duplicate keys to fit the drop boxes, which would put a high risk on the casinos. And they all knew Slim from over the years and years and years and years and trusted him and trusted his record keeping. And it could be the case that if the casino needed some more keys for the counting room to open up the boxes, they would just call up Slim and order keys, and he could look up the code and provide them. However, at his end, it was kept in a coded form so that you just couldn't look at the card. You had to know how to decode the card to know what the key combination was. The original drop box, to overcome the problem of dealer stealing, the box first is in the counting room. They open up the front and they reach inside and they reset a slide. So now the slot on the top is open. When it goes out on the table, there's a bracket on the table and the box is popped onto that bracket and it clicks and locks into place, and the slide is open at that point. So the dealers put bills through with a paddle through the slot. When it's time to take the box off the table, they put a key in the front and turn the key. And the first thing that happens is the slide releases, closes the slot, and it locks and can't be opened. So that the slide pops shut, and then it comes off the table. So when the security personnel are carrying it back to the cage, there's no slot, and it's got it takes 1 key to get it off and on the table, and a second key to open up the door to the money. So that was the standard model, and it was in use for years and years and years and years, up until 1976. And Bill Hara Bill Hara wanted to run a well-managed accountant-type business, and it kind of rankled Slim. Slim didn't like POs. He liked handshakes, and he liked good old boys. And he didn't like dealing with purchasing agents and accountants. And he liked to deal with the managers directly. So he never got, and Bill Hara also wanted the best price in town, and that irritated Slim. So Bill Hara took one of Slim's boxes to LA and had a knockoff box made. And if you ever see them, it was done in a hammer tone gray finish. Slim's were always done in a wrinkle finish, in a burgundy wrinkle finish. Bill Hara's were done in it looked like a spray can out of a Home Depot store, cheesy metallic kind of aluminum color. But now all of a sudden there's competition, and I'm not sure if other people besides Hara were buying them from that source, probably so. So Slim went back to the drawing board, and he had accumulated over the years a number of improvements in the box which he made. One of the improvements came about because the gamblers would complain the door was so small that when they had a big night, the money inside would bridge up, and they'd open the box to open the door and shake, and the money wouldn't come out. It was so much money packed in there it wouldn't come out. And so they would have to reach in with their hand and pull it out, and they complained because the edge of the door was catching on their French cuffs on their expensive shirts, and they didn't like catching their shirts on the door. And Slim's answer to that was just said, take smaller handfuls. So he developed a second generation box that has the door on the side, so it's a big, huge door, and the money comes out. And he moved the second lock to the side, and so it just had a number of improved features, and he got a patent on it, so Bill Harrah couldn't copy it. Here are other items in his full line of casino products: check trays, dealer's trays, had check racks for crap tables. On the right-hand side is just one of the components for slot machines. These are the discs that go on the side that do the pay combination. These are all illustrations from his catalog. He invented the Keno board. It was a takeoff on old bingo boards. He invented and made all of this generation of Keno boards for about 25 years. In fact, when I came here, the better part of my job was wiring Keno boards. The ones at the Golden Gate Casino I did, and the Sarah Hotel we did a bunch, and anyway. And of course, they're long gone now. These have all been replaced by electronic ones. But on the lower right is a switch. There's 80 numbers, rows 8 by 10, and they can't stand downtime in a casino. So if a switch went bad, it would shut the game down until they could replace a switch. So all of these switches were individually replaceable in the field. All you did was you just grabbed the button and pulled, and the whole switch assembly would come out, and they would have a blank unnumbered button that would go in its place, and you shove the blank in until you had a chance to fix that switch. So the switches could be maintained immediately. Also, to reset at the end of a game, they push the buttons down for the draw, which is 20 out of 80. At the end, rather than having to reset all 20 numbers individually, there's a knob at the lower right at the bottom, and they just pull that knob, and all the buttons reset at the same time. So, again, these are all innovations of Slim's. So we'll talk about a few close friends. Oh, incidentally, I'm going to ask you ahead now, for a question and answer period, how many people are going to like to ask a question? How about raise your hand? Good, okay, we know how much time to leave. Oh, just as an aside, I would mention that I was on site at the Aruba Sheraton when they opened. Slim and I went down for the opening because he outfitted the entire casino, provided everything, everything except the carpet on the floor. And so we arrived, the tables were there, we outfitted the tables, we had all the internal supplies, slot stands, and the slot machines weren't there. Well, we got on the telephone and we said, what happened? And it turns out they were Cardinal machines which came from Australia, and they were on a boat that was supposed to be heading through the Panama Canal to Aruba. Well, there was a storm off the coast of the Philippines, or there's a storm in the South Pacific, and so instead the ship was diverting to the Philippines and then coming through the canal, and they said it's going to be 6 weeks late. Well, the casino was highly upset that they would be running for 6 weeks with no slot machines. So we contacted, by international telephone, which was an adventure in those days, we contacted the Cardinal Company in Australia, and we ordered a duplicate set of slot machines to come in by air freight. And so we had to stay around for a week or two while they got more machines set up and got them on air freight, because they did a back of the envelope calculation and found that the slot machines would have paid for themselves. The duplicate set of machines would fully pay for themselves in the 6 weeks they were going to be late. So, and then when the boat came in from the Philippines, then they could go sell the old machines somewhere else. So I got to play, hang around the casino, and I got to play pit boss for about 10 days. They were shorthanded. There was a fellow named, they only allowed 2 Americans in, and all the rest had to be locals. And I was pretty good at 21 and had been doing System 21 play here in Las Vegas. And so I got to be assistant pit boss in the casino for 21, and got to comp drinks for college girls coming down on weekends in Aruba. Silver Rich was a casino manager, and another fellow from Steubenville, Ohio, that name escapes me. So that was my one foray on the on the casino side. Close friends of Slim. Well, his closest friend was Whit Watson, who was from childhood in Kentucky. They grew up together in grade school. And many, many years later, in about 1962 or 3, Whit moved to Las Vegas, long since retired, moved to Las Vegas, and in the front of Slim's manufacturing company, set up an art and frame shop, because that was his hobby. He collected antique frames, and he did matting, and he had some fancy machines to cut oval mats and so on. And so their friendship pretty well remained through those years, over a space of probably about 80 years. And Vic Shorb, as I mentioned, was a long-time friend as they started riding motorcycles in LA and ended up being slot partners in Bakersfield. And then Vic was a slot operator here in Las Vegas. Vic, I believe, either invented or co-invented or helped develop the rotary payout mechanism for slot machines. In the original days, they had adapted slot machines that were intended for use in bars and gas stations for casino use, but physically they didn't fit the casino business at all. Slim developed the jackpot boards that would display where the jackpots were. They had a tower that went up on the top of the slot machine, so change girls could come over and pay jackpots. They had counters on the machines to count jackpots for security use. And one of them was that Vic Shorb developed a mechanism so that the coins would pay out and be counted. There was a hopper inside and a rotary mechanism, and the coins would count out individually. This way, the machines could pay their own jackpots, and it eliminated a lot of mechanical problems. So Vic would come by our company every now and then and use the equipment. He made his own mechanisms and would come down to our shop and do some of the welding. So they remain lifelong friends. And I've mentioned P.S. Bible. Another old friend was Rod Rofer from Bakersfield. His nickname was Slim in Bakersfield, and so the odd thing was we had two Slims in the shop. We had Slim Rofer and we had Slim Ewing. So the way it was everybody called Rofer Rofer except Slim Ewing, and Slim Ewing called Rofer Slim. So to Slim, Rofer was Slim. Everybody else called him Rofer. He would come back about every 6 months and work for about 6 months, and he had some land in Bakersfield. So he'd go up to Oregon, cut Christmas trees on a flatbed truck, and go down to Bakersfield and sell Christmas trees. And then spring would come, and he'd come over to Vegas and work for about 6 months. And so again, they were long-term friends. Al and Helen Remington, they was Slim's partner in Wyoming in the casino there. And John Donahue was his partner in Honduras. But they had a falling out later on as that casino failed. Let's see, let's do, right now, let's take questions. And then what I have is another 2 slides, which will be some anecdotes on some of these people from those days, little stories. And these are basically all Slim stories. I mean, he was a man of 1,000 stories. He had an unending little reservoir of stories about peoples and things. So we have a microphone in the center, so you'll get on tape. How about come to that center and ask your question? Is that okay?
Just for curiosity, how long does it take? You said the Ewing mold is a slow process. How long does it take to do one chip?
Making the individual chips then,
yeah.
How long did it mold? The cycle time probably would be under 2 minutes, but somewhere 1 minute to 2 minutes. Well, roughly a minute of heating and cooling. It might be even a shade longer than that.
On today's orders, even though it's not Ewing, when they order 100,000 chips, how do they do that? Do they have 100 machines going at a time, or?
Well, on today's, I'm not sure how they do that. With the Burt Company, it would be multiple molds. They had 2 production lines there. One of them was the 4-up that we saw on the slide. They had a second one which was low tech, and they had many more of those. They had about 6 or 8 of them, 10 of them in a line, and they had something like some kind of plates, and they would put all the stuff in the plates, put the plates into the press, and the girl would just go down from machine to machine, set one up, go down to the next machine, and they would cycle through the heating and cooling. And I don't think those were the casino checks they were doing in that, it was, I was only there one day, so I was actually more fascinated by the billiard ball end of it, because they mold the billiard balls in a crude way, and then they had this huge machine that was a centerless grinder that had two wheels that were about 3.5, 4 feet in diameter with grooves in them, and they put the billiard ball in the center and go, and a billiard ball would fall out. And that had more sizzle and snap to it. And then the other presses were just sitting in the corner just chugging away. So I can't be too helpful on that, but it is a slow process, and it does take a fair amount of time. And it was hand labor because they had to put all these little inserts in the mold. Yes.
Both Chipco and Atlantic Molding claim a heritage to the Burt brothers. What's the connection or the linkage?
Say again, what last part?
What's the connection between Chipco, Atlantic Molding, and on their web pages they claim a heritage to the Burt brothers? So who's the direct line there?
That's above my pay grade. No, I don't know the heritage. The research I did actually was off the internet to find the history of Chipco, and the fact that they bought the company, they moved. The current, in Portland, Maine, the current site is owned by the city, and it's actually a Superfund toxic site, and has been condemned and unused now for a number of years. But Chipco went on to get into the higher technology end of things. And in fact, I found online a very interesting report that was sort of an R&D plan for the company. It was a consulting company came in and laid out for them, here's how to get into the whole next generation of chips. On the other hand, there's no follow-up about what they actually did.
Yeah.
So
I've been out to the Raymond plant, the other end to what they call RF, radio frequency chips, which is their latest thing. But as they say, if you go Atlantic Molding, they claim a heritage to the Burt brothers, and Chipco also. So I'm just wondering, why do they both claim a heritage?
Yeah, Atlantic Molding is a new player to me, so I can't be too helpful there. And also remember, my information, unfortunately, is 25 years out of date from the times that I was with Slim and was there.
Yeah, both companies are out of Maine, so.
Right.
Thank you.
Good.
Do you know if Slim Ewing had any conversations with or regarded as friends, people like Bud Jones or Paul Indy of Paulson, or if he saw them as rivals? Do you know if they talked at all?
They were never antagonistic rivals that I heard. I hardly ever heard Slim say a bad word about anybody. There were maybe a couple of people that he had had no use for, but he didn't really have a mean bone in his body. And they were friendly co-suppliers because he would sell casino equipment to them. See, they would go out to sell a package and they'd need drop boxes. So he would sell to the other chip suppliers the things that he made exclusively. And likewise, before he had his mold, he had to buy through them too. So they were in good friends. Anyway, okay, here are just a few people. We'll kind of wrap up with this over the next 5 or 10 minutes. Art Gamlin, they had all these little specialty shops in town that did the different components. Slim did everything in metal and plastic. Art Gamlin did the layouts, primarily table games, not roulette. He was at the corner of Bonanza and I guess it would be Maine, Bonanza and Maine. And his company was called Gambling Art, and it was kind of a takeoff on his name, which was Art Gamlin. On a couple of trips to the Caribbean, he and his wife went along. Actually, I remember playing chess with him on an airplane heading toward the Virgin Islands. Bill Glenn, we mentioned. Jake and Bill Kozloff. Jake was a member of the Purple Mob in about 1928 in Cleveland, which was a section of Murder Incorporated. He was in the mob then at the age of about 19. He went on through a number of incarnations to become the manager of the Riviera in Cuba the night it fell and Castro took over. And his brother, much younger brother, they kind of looked like father and son. Bill, his brother, was quite a bit younger. By the time I knew them, they were doing the Intercontinental in Curaçao. They were the managers there. And they had about 5 casinos. They had one in St. Martin, and they had one in Bonaire, and I think one in Paramaribo, Venezuela. And so they were, you know, interesting, fun. Jake Lansky is Meyer Lansky's brother. He was a kind of a close social friend of Slim. He was in contact with Slim from Florida, and I don't know if he was still involved in the operation, but all I would know is we would sit around the dinner table at Slim's home, and Jake Lansky would phone up, and they would just chat about something or other. Slim kind of held court at home in the evening from 6 o'clock to 8 o'clock around the kitchen table. The phone would ring, and it would just be somebody calling from somewhere around the world, and half the time it was social, and half the time it was business. Oh, very good. Okay. I did that from memory. Very good. The Cellini brothers, I don't know a lot about them, but it was Dino Cellini and his brother were in Yugoslavia. So at this time, Dino would call up and he'd need dice or cards or checks or something. And Jay Vandermark has an interesting story. Jay was at the Sahara. Well, first they called Jay the man with the earphones. He was a crossroads slot sheet back in the Bakersfield days in the 40s, and knew Slim then. He came to Las Vegas and continued as a slot sheet, and he got taken out in the desert and beat up so bad that he lost most of his hearing. And so he had hearing aids that were so loud that when you would talk to him, you could hear your voice echo back from the hearing aid. So they called him the man with the earphones. He became slot manager at the Stardust during the time when they had a great big fraud there, where in the counting room they rigged the machines to short count coins, and then and of course they weigh the coins. They don't count the coins. They weigh them, and they rig the scales to do short weight. So if they short weighed 10%, they could skim 10% of the money off, and it wouldn't show up in the records. And then they went out in front and put in a couple of change booths, and the stolen money would go through those change booths. So again, that didn't go through the counting process. This has been documented in a couple of books and magazine articles, and the word I got was that it was Jay Vandermark's thing. That is, he was the fellow who thought of it and did it and scammed the money. He went ultimately down, skipped town and went down to Mexico and disappeared. When the word was that they went down and had him eliminated. And other sources say that it was official policy of the Stardust, and he was just carrying out orders. And other people said, no, he was the one that took the money. So I don't know. But otherwise, he was in and out of the shop all the time. We'd see Jay. George Larson was an interesting character. He had a broken finger, cut off finger. He was short one finger. He was about grizzled, 85 years old. The reason was he was been punching license plates at the state prison up in Carson City, and he went to prison for armed robbery. And with my whole apologies for my story, what the armed robbery he did was that he went to a service station as a young man. They wouldn't open the safe, so he took a cold soldering iron and put it on the behind of the service station attendant and plugged it in. And then the service station attendant was able to remember the combination for the safe. So they got George for armed robbery with a soldering iron, and went to prison and punched license plates. And he was elderly by the time he was hanging around with us. John Scarney was a magician of some repute, gambling consultant. I only met him once. I met him once with Slim in New York at the Waldorf Astoria Hotel, and we were supposed to have dinner that night, and Scarney was a consultant to the Hilton Group and begged off and said, I have another appointment with Slim, I'm very sorry, we'll do dinner some other time. And so that was the one meeting. I'm also an amateur magician, and Scarney is a folk hero in the magician circles. Bud Sweet and Jerry Hayde ran in Bonaire. They ran a casino together and multiple operations. Jerry's a member of the club here, sometimes comes, but he's getting kind of up there in years. Bud Sweet, when I knew him, was the manager of the Hilton in Curaçao. And he would drive Slim up the walls because he didn't like green felt. He liked gray. And so for Bud, everything had to be on gray felt, and it took special orders, and you couldn't inventory. And that's enough. One or two little anecdotes, and then we'll wrap up. Slim was a rabid non-smoker, anti-smoker. He could smell cigarette smoke clear across the room and wrinkle his nose and get irritated. He never yelled at people or embarrassed them in public, but he riled against it, and the company was strictly non-smoking. He said the reason was that when he was a kid, one of their summer jobs was picking the tobacco worms off of tobacco, and in those days they were barefoot working the tobacco fields, and so you couldn't step on them. You had to kill the tobacco worms, and you couldn't step on them to kill them. So what they would have to do is pull them apart in their hands and break them in half and pop them in half. Well, the tobacco worms are brown from eating the tobacco, and they smell. And every now and then, the juice from the tobacco worms would hit their face, and they would actually taste it. And so he had this taste of tobacco from killing tobacco worms, and that stuck in his mind the rest of his life. Hated smoking, and so around the company. When I started my company for 25 years, we likewise were a non-smoking company. People could smoke, but the building was smoke-free. There was no smoking in the building. And when we hired people, we were preferential. We kind of tell them, say, well, better if you don't smoke. We don't tell you what you can't do at home, but around the company, no smoking. Slim had a second home up in Goldfield, Esmeralda County, and he went to the sheriff one time to get a gun permit. And the sheriff said, "Oh, Slim," he said, "you don't want a gun permit. They cost $20. Tell you what, I'll make you deputy constable. You get a gun permit, it's free, and you also get to carry a badge." And so Slim liked that. So for the rest of his life, he had a snub-nosed .38 in his pocket, had a little pocket holster made, so he carried the pistol with him whenever he was in Nevada. We were down in Ecuador going through security at the airport, and of course he didn't have the gun with him, but he still had his badge. Well, in those days there was no metal detectors. They had a soldier at the gate, and they patted everybody down. So I went through, and they patted me down, and Slim came up, and he didn't want anybody to touch him. He didn't figure this guy ought to be touching him, so he reached in his pocket, opened up his wallet, he showed the Esmeralda County Deputy Constable badge, and the soldier stood back and saluted him, and Slim walked through the gate. Oh, Keeley Smith. Louis Prima was tall, Keeley Smith was short, and they had a home in the Desert Inn, DI Country Club. And so Slim made a shower nozzle for them on a track that went up and down, so they could set the shoulder height or the nozzle height. For Jake Kozloff, he would carry money out of Havana. What happens if you're a trusted person that they know in the Caribbean casinos, when you're leaving after a visit, they would just say to you, "Slim, here is an envelope. Take it back to California or back to Miami. Someone will meet you at the airport and ask for it, and just give it to him." And so he would put the envelope in his pocket, take it back home, and it's the skim money coming back. And somebody would meet him at the airport and say, "Slim Ewing, yes. You have something for me? Here's an envelope." So, and he loved to do that. He would watch The Untouchables. The only TV he ever watched was just faithful to watch The Untouchables, because he always lamented silently that he was in LA during the Prohibition years in Chicago, and he really wanted to be a part of the organized crime in Chicago. So we watched Elliot Ness, but he's always rooting for the Italians when we're watching that show. When the Desert Inn mob started the Stardust, they called him in, and in fact, there's an article in this current issue of your magazine that talks about this phase. They called Slim into the breakfast meeting at the DI, and they went back in the back of the coffee shop, which was closed, and they had 6, 8 guys around a table, and they said, "Here's our plan for the Stardust. We're doing this, 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 this. Give us a layout." So Slim grabbed a placemat and wrote down how many tables, how many square feet, how many slot machines, Keno, yes, no. And said, "Okay, it's to be about $100,000." And they said, "That's fine. Go to the cage and draw $50,000, and you can get started." So he went out to the cage, and they gave him $50,000 in cash, and he went out and began to get the metal and get all the stuff set up. And that's how it was in those days. It was pretty formal, everybody informal. People all knew each other, respected each other. And when it came to be purchase orders and accountants, then Slim kind of tuned out on that. And finally, a joke. Slim had a million gags and jokes. He had some fake business cards made up. And the label, when we would travel on airplanes, if you see that red label at the bottom, it says, "Caution, contents of this container, when taken internally, may lead to violent intercourse." We get on an airplane, and he would order a vodka or a drink, and he'd slap that bottle on the drink and then come back to the stewardess and hold it up and say, "What are you trying to tell me?" And they would look at that thing and they would, "Where'd that come from?" And they'd laugh about it. Sometimes they'd go in and take it to the captain, show the captain. Sometimes the captain would come back and say, "Hey, that's a great gag. Got any more of those?" Or we'd slap it on a coffee cup. And he got where he'd have it in his hand. The stewardess handed him a coffee cup, and he would just grab the coffee cup like this, slap the label on, turn it around, and then point it right back to her, just like it came that way. And some of them were really baffled. They'd go back to the galley and say, "Where'd this thing come from?" So he used it as a conversation starter. So, to wind up, here's good old Slim Ewing. If you look at the picture with him with a big grin on his face, with the veil and the red hair in the background, that's my wife. That was at our wedding. And what I cut out of the picture was Ann's mother. He's there chatting with my mother-in-law, and my bride is right in the background. But he, as I said, was truly a self-made man. He started at age 15, no high school education, and built a manufacturing company. It was in Vegas, moved 4 different times, grew. He retired, and even in retirement, he continued to just operate as a salesman. He did field sales work. He was more of an influence on my life than my father. He truly became my godfather from a career standpoint. My father's a doctor of medicine. My brother's a doctor, my daughter's in medical school, my nephew's in medical school, and I dodged the bullet. I was an engineer, so I followed in Slim's footsteps. He wanted me to take over the company, and I respectfully declined because I was an electronic engineer and did communications, and even though I loved the locksmithing and the sheet metal work and all of that, I wanted to stay true to my career. He was very generous and very loyal. Bertie cooked dinner for everybody in town. You never knew. He'd come home, who's coming for dinner tonight? And anybody coming through, fellas that worked at the shop, visitors, whenever I would come back in the succeeding years, typically to trade shows like Comdex here, or we did a lot of work in the security industry, doing electronic security. We'd come to the security shows, and we always come by Ewing's and have dinner. He had all these stories, almost everything I've said today is a story that actually came from Slim Ewing. And he always had that twinkle in his eye, a real smile, a real little twinkle. And he was, one of a kind personality that matched a lot of those casino owners and casino managers too. They really had an interesting, colorful story behind them. And of course, the change occurred when Howard Hughes came to town, and everything became much more businesslike. They put in the TV cameras, accountants took over, monitored the slot machines on computer, and they took a lot of the human factor out of the business. But he was one of the last people that had that very heavy personal factor. I'd like to thank you. We had a great meeting here today. Good. And if there's any pressing concluding question, otherwise come up and see me up here. Thank you.